Andrew Tate could now spend months and months inside a Miami jail cell before anybody even decides whether he should be extradited to Britain. His next detention hearing is on the 13th of August. Britain has until the 16th of September to submit its full extradition documents. And even after that, the legal challenge continues for months. So could Andrew Tate genuinely be locked up throughout this entire process? Could he be released at the next hearing in August? And what actually happens from here? What comes next? Let's go through some clarifying information. Andrew and Tristan Tate were arrested in Miami on the 18th of July and remained detained in Miami while fighting the UK's extradition request. Their detention hearing is scheduled on the 13th of August. Their lawyers plan to file for release by the 5th of August. And the UK has until the 16th of September to submit its full extradition documents. There is an important clarification to make here before I move on with the video. The charges discussed in this video are allegations. Andrew and Tristan Tate deny any wrongdoing, and extradition itself would not prove that either of the men are guilty. This video is about their detention, the extradition process, and what actually happens next, not deciding any underlying criminal case. The CPS has emphasized that the proceedings are active, that the defendants retain the right to a fair trial, and that bringing charges is not a finding of guilt. So, what's actually changed? Ultimately, when I first covered this story, Andrew and Tristan Tate had just been arrested in Miami. And the big question was, well, what's going to happen now? And that answer, at least initially, is that they are staying exactly where they are, in jail. And, they remain inside the federal detention center in Miami while the court begin dealing with Britain's extradition request, essentially. Their next major hearing is on the 13th of August, and that hearing is not expected to decide whether they are ultimately extradited. It will decide on the more immediate question, which is, well, are they going to remain in jail, or will they be released while they fight this case? So why could this take months? Extradition is not simply Britain giving America a phone call and saying, yo, look, we want to get Andrew and Tristan Tate over here, so put them on a flight. Britain has to provide legal documents supporting its request. And then American courts have to consider whether the legal requirements for extradition are met. The Tate brothers can oppose the request and challenge different parts of the case. And even if the court eventually approves the extradition, there is still an executive stage before they can actually be transferred. Britain has until the 16th of September to submit its full request. And, this process is really just at the beginning, and it could take months, not days. Reports show that, the final executive decision would rest with the US Secretary of State. The internet moves in hours, court moves in months and years, and sometimes even longer than that. Could they be released, I think, is a big question that a lot of people are potentially asking. Their lawyers intend to file motion asking for their release. Their basic position is that the brothers are not flight risks. They point to the fact that the Tates have participated in legal proceedings in Romania rather than simply just disappearing off the map. But release is not guaranteed. And I'm sure a lot of people will be happy about that. A lot of people won't be happy about that. The judge will have to decide whether they can stay and be trusted to remain available throughout the extradition process and under what particular restrictions. So the 13th of August is a big date, really, for these two brothers. If release is refused, this could become a very long stay inside federal detention. If they are released, they will begin fighting extradition. They'll simply be doing it from outside of jail. The brothers' lawyers say that they are not flight risks and cite their participation in Romanian proceedings since 2022. Their planned bailed motion is due by the 5th of August. Bail is not freedom. Being released would not end the case. It would only change where they wait until, while it continues, The contrast with Tate's online identity, and this is, I think, where, the story becomes more interesting because it's not simply just another court date. Andrew Tate built an enormous online identity around control. Control your mind, control your emotions, control your money, control your body, control your circumstances, and never to appear weak, never allow another person to dictate your future. But legal systems operate according to their own timetable. You cannot motivate your way out of a court schedule. You cannot dominate an extradition process by posting harder stuff online. And right now, regardless of how wealthy, famous, or influential Andrew Tate is, some of the biggest decisions about his future belong to people he cannot control. For somebody, I think, whose entire identity is based around personal power, that may be the most uncomfortable part of the situation, especially for someone like Mr. Tate himself. And the reaction online, supporters are already calling the case a political persecution. His critics are talking as though the guilt has been already established. And once again, both sides appear to be polar opposites, which is completely understandable for a man like Tate. A bit like Marmite, you either love him or hate him. I will not say he's guilty with certainty, and I will not say he's not guilty with certainty, because the reasonable position is often just less exciting and more boring. The allegations are extremely serious, and there is, they must be taken with the utmost seriousness because they are mega allegations. The CPS believes there is a case to prosecute. Andrew and Tristan Tate deny any wrongdoing. And the evidence now has to be examined through the legal process. The CPS says the UK now seeks extradition in connection with the original 21 charges plus 38 further charges concerning 4 additional victims, alleged victims, should I say, bringing the total number of alleged victims to 7. The CPS explicitly states that charging decisions are not findings of guilt. Supporting due process does not mean dismissing the allegations. So you can support due process and, still take the allegations very, very seriously. That's why we live in a civilized world to some degree, because we have these judicial processes. Taking the allegations seriously does not mean pretending conviction has already happened. Both standards can exist at the same time. And I think that's probably the hardest thing that, for most people find difficult to hold in that position of, well, I don't know if they're guilty, essentially, and I don't know if they're not guilty. So let's just wait and see what happens. That's the fair place to be in. You've got to take the allegations seriously, but also don't take the allegations as conviction. So what's going to happen now? Their lawyers file for release. The judge considers a request. Britain submits its full extradition documents, and from there, the brothers could be facing a legal fight lasting for months, maybe even years, more years. Andrew Tate may be released during that process. He may remain detained. We just simply don't know. Even if the extradition is eventually approved, that would still not decide whether he is guilty of the underlying charges. But I think the main thing that becomes clear in all of this is that this is no longer just another temporary internet controversy. Then, that disappears when the algorithm finds a new subject. Andrew Tate could spend months dealing with the process. He cannot simply argue, intimidate, or influence his way around. His supporters can post, his critics can celebrate. But right now, the courts controls what happens next. And just on a personal reflection on all of this, I think, again, I'll stress the point that what stands out to me most is that the internet is divided into, you only generally see the 2 camps, but there are 3 camps. The 2 camps are, well, Andrew Tate must be guilty, send him to the gulag, send him to jail for the rest of his days. And that's a fair point in some regard. If people want to think that, go ahead, think that. The other camp is Andrew Tate supporters, where they just think, well, this is obviously a political scandal, political persecution, and a political warfare, essentially, on Mr. Tate and his brother. And for me personally, I don't hold neither of those positions. I think I don't know all the information. I don't know all the facts. I don't know the evidence. I don't know all the information in the case, and I don't know all the evidence, and I don't know every little fine piece of detail. So how can I possibly make the overall judgment on this? Well, I can't. All I can do is come with the facts and say that I'm on the fence. I think the allegations should be absolutely investigated, and I think process should take place, and whatever happens from it happens from it. If Tate goes to jail, then Tate goes to jail. If he don't go to jail, then he don't go to jail. There's going to be people happy on whichever way this goes. There's going to be people sad whichever way this goes. And yeah, that's my personal take on this. I think it's a big thing which isn't going to go away anytime soon, because these things take months. So I think it's worth pointing out and worth staying in tune with this topic, and worth providing a level-headed middle ground sort of position rather than jumping to the extremes in either direction. This is Jake O'Neill Talks, honest commentary on modern life.